My name is Craig Picken. I'm an executive recruiter. More than a decade ago, I started my practice for one purpose: to use my experience as a former military aviator, business jet sales executive, and P&L leader to help aviation and aerospace companies and their executives be fast, adaptable, and strategic. I do these podcasts to inspire and inform, but more importantly, they are a focused platform to help business leaders grow. Welcome to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. Hey, welcome back to the Aerospace Executive Podcast. I am absolutely thrilled to have with me today Brigadier General William Bill David. Bill is a combat decorated Army veteran. He's won multiple Bronze Stars and other distinguished decorations from his 28 years of active duty service in the Army. He's led some major organizations as also graduated from West Point. Upon leaving the Army, he spent 15 years with Cubic Corporation, where he became the VP of Defense, leading Army combat training programs, and then became the COO of Valiant Integrated Services. Bill, hey, thank you for coming on today.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Craig. Glad to be here.
So you've led some major organizations, both in the Army and then carrying on into the defense arena, in private industry. With the age of COVID upon us now, how should CEOs be thinking of leading their teams in what is now a very chaotic environment?
Well, as we talked about before, Craig, my experience after retiring from the Army in the aerospace and defense market space was on the services side. Providing services to Department of Defense organizations, very, very Army-centric, not surprising given that my background was Army. But also providing service support to the other services as well. So for that particular market or for that particular industry, it's a very, very uncertain time. And I think my number one piece of advice would be CEOs and their direct reports should be over communicating to their customers. And the reason for that is I think the dynamics of this COVID-19 pandemic are very, very likely to change over time, depending on a number of variables that we know about and probably some other variables that we don't. So customers are going to have a view. Customers are going to respond to those situations, and they're going to have a view today of what they need to do differently, or what they need to do more of, or what they need to quit doing in order to satisfy their organizational requirements, whether that's selling something or training or whatever it might be. They're going to have a view of what they need now that is different than what service providers gave to them yesterday. And that demand is likely to change based on variables. I mean, as an example, if medical science is able to produce a vaccine quickly, within a year, that will change the demand side. Mm-hmm. So I think number one, CEOs need to be over communicating with the customers and staying abreast of what it is the customers really want. And then obviously taking a look inside their own organizations and trying to figure out, number A, can we provide that? B, if we can't provide that, is there can we get a teammate who might be able to provide that? And, there might be a number of the situation may cause business to form any number of teaming arrangements with other companies that they never considered before.
Yep.
So I think that's number one thing they need to do is a CEO I would suggest over communicate to your customers. Make sure your direct reports are over communicating to customers so that you can have as clear a picture as possible of what it is your customers actually want.
Yeah, and I could, look, communication. Nobody ever got in trouble from over communicating, and you're absolutely right there. It's interesting to me that a lot of businesses have come out, recently, and it's like we're all in this together, message, and yeah, we are, and that's great, but the one thing I've been encouraging people to do is go to their customers and go, what are you going to need in 6 months? Once, what do you think you're going to need? How is all this going to affect you? And how can we help you get there? And a lot of people are like, hey, look, I don't really know what I need, but I think most people have a good idea of, what's going to happen and where they're going to need to be. And that constant dialogue does help people at least create it might be a broad direction, but at least whether you need to go northeast or southeast as a start, and you can start to hone it in from there.
Yeah,
what about?
I was really impressed with. You may recall I can't recall the gentleman's first name, but Dyson, the guy in the UK who makes vacuum cleaners.
Oh yeah.
When there was an apparent surge demand for ventilators, he and his company went to work at the QuickTime and spent about $25 million, a little over 20 million pounds of their own money to convert plants, and instead of making vacuum cleaners, making ventilators. Now, as it turned out, the demand for ventilators did not meet the expectation. But the fact is that Mr. Dyson and his company were extremely agile and were ready to meet that demand should it be needed within the United Kingdom. And so now they're looking at ways to market those ventilators that aren't needed at home and, sell them to other companies. But I think that's a wonderful example of how an innovative CEO, who, by the way, is in his late 70s, pirouetted on top of a pinhead and reoriented his company to meet a demand.
Isn't it amazing? There's a Wall Street Journal article about that same thing, and it talked about how all of a sudden, in companies that have been very slow acting, all of a sudden this comes along and they're able to, like General Motors, Ford were a couple of examples that the journal used, Dyson, as you mentioned. All of a sudden the innovative spirit came out of companies and they were able to pivot. And you think about, why aren't companies able to do that more often? Do we just get all holed up in our, well, we've never done that before, bureaucracies and mindsets, such that we don't even try? Does it should it take an emergency for people to really get out of their own way? I guess is a good question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because that goes to the heart of company culture, really. I mean, there are companies that put a premium on innovation, put a premium on, obviously, profit and return to the shareholders. But there are other companies that, their culture values other things. I mean, there are some companies, one that comes to mind, and we take Procter & Gamble, very, very successful company. But Procter & Gamble has a history of promoting from within. They don't hire from outside. They promote from within.
Right.
And so as you move up the pyramid of Procter & Gamble, you're going to get people that are steeped in the Procter & Gamble way. Now, whether that is Whether that brings the necessary degree of organizational agility, I don't know. But there are companies that can respond, and there are companies that can't. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the book Good to Great.
Sure.
And, that book has some wonderful examples of, companies that just, couldn't respond to challenges that were much less demanding than COVID-19. I mean, how many Sears stores are are in shopping malls these days?
Yep.
How many shopping malls are thriving these days? Those kinds of things. So I think that's an interesting field of study in its own right about why companies survive and why they don't.
Yep. I totally agree with you. And it just, I never really thought about it until I read that journal article about, wow, they're absolutely right. All of a sudden the innovative spirit came out of some companies that had been struggling to find it for a long time. And, with impressive results. But, let's talk about, so there's going to be some challenging, everybody's saying some challenging economic times, the next 6 to 12 months. As a senior military officer, leader, combat officer, how did you pick your teams? What do you think,
Well,
leaders and CEOs should be looking for right now in picking their teams, and what might be a challenging environment?
yeah, I mean, as you know, in some cases in the military, you don't maybe get a choice on picking a particular person that you want to fill a particular billet. Sometimes that choice is made for you. In the corporate world, you have a little more latitude, but you may have chosen someone to fill a role, or a CEO or senior manager may have chosen someone to fill a certain role because they needed that person's skill set at the particular time they selected them to fill that position. Now the demands are different. I think senior managers have to evaluate whether their key personnel, their brain trust, that whether they have the capacity to provide the skill sets and the leadership that they need now. And I don't know if I'm making myself clear. If there's been a change, can that person grow into it? And if the answer is yes, then I think it's incumbent on the senior manager, for the health of the organization, to do all they can to help that person grow into the demands of the position. But if they can't, and they're not responsive to appropriate coaching, I don't think senior managers can be bashful about making a change when the change is necessary. But I think it all starts with whoever the boss of the organization is, whether it's the CEO or the president, the commander, whatever. I mean, that individual sets the tone of the culture of the organization. And I would submit to you, if the culture is not one in which there is trust among the top team, and a commitment to open and honest communication without recrimination, then if that environment doesn't exist, that company, whatever line of work it's in, is going to have severe problems and may not make it. Those are foundational elements of any high-performing organization that I've ever been a part of. And those are elements that have been absent in the organizations that I've been a part of, in which I couldn't wait to get out.
Yeah.
So that's the foundational piece. And if you have that foundational piece, I believe that that the boss can use the capabilities of his or her top team to rationally define the situation, kind of go through a SWOT analysis process, and do it in a disciplined and a very inclusive sort of way, so that you actually do have a clear view of what is out in front of you, threats and opportunities in particular. So the CEO's got to lead that process, or has to ensure that process happens, because if the company doesn't do that, in addition to being a great way to get people on board, if the company doesn't do that, then you're kind of in the situation where if you don't know where you're going, any road's going to get you there, right?
Pretty much. Yeah, no, look, some of the conversations I've had with people is, hey, look, you better, take a look at, if you think you're going to be challenged for the next 12 months from a revenue standpoint, now is the time to get everybody aligned with your goals and with your goals for the next 12 months. And anybody who's not aligned, take a hard look at them. And it's going to be people who can't add value, better figure out how to add value now, or else it becomes a meaningless conversation. Somebody who cannot add value to the organization becomes overhead, and it's like waiting an airplane.
Yeah, I think there's a likelihood that within the aerospace and defense industry, we are likely to see even greater consolidation the longer this pandemic pans out. I mean, you've got, as you've got small companies, you've got mid-sized companies, you've got the big larges. Now, do I think Boeing or Northrop Grumman is in danger of going out of business? No. But I think a lot of smalls and mids could be, because they just don't have the they don't have the cash reserves to sustain severe downturns in revenue over extended periods of time. I'm familiar with a couple of mid-sized companies that are, if they're not careful, they're going to go into a death spiral if they're not doing it already. I mean, they've lost revenue. So what's the first thing companies do when they lose revenue? They lay off staff, right?
Yep.
And so they start laying off staff, which impedes their ability to sustain the business, much less grow the business. So I think there's a real chance that we're going to see further consolidation in this market space. And I'm sure, and I don't know Northrop Grumman, I'm just using them as an example. They're a huge company. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised if the corporate development folks at Northrop Grumman weren't looking at this as an opportunity for some very advantageous acquisitions. I think every large company is probably doing that right now.
Oh, sure. There's so much dry powder out there right now that, that's what a lot of people are telling me is, hey, look, we're going to go, we'll figure out how to get stronger.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think a lot of times, if you take a manager and you make a hire because this individual knows a particular market space real well, they're well connected, they know how to manage profitability, but they're not terribly innovative, you got a challenge. So back to your point on picking the team, I think CEOs are going to have to um, give a lot of thought to the skill sets that they need on their team to survive. Um, perhaps it may not be. Perhaps innovation may be something that is more needed now than the ability to gain new business when the
Yep.
business is changing. So
Yeah. No, I hear you.
yeah.
One of the things that, when I was in the Navy, it was funny. We would put all these elaborate plans together, and then we'd launch off the carrier knowing that within 10 minutes of launch, our plans would all start to melt down. And then we'd go to, plan B and C and regroup. And I know you saw the same thing in the Army, how did you train your teams to pivot quickly, assess the situation, make smart decisions? Ambiguous times call for people who can think well in ambiguous situations. How did you teach your teams to do that?
Well, we actually practiced it. I think it was Patton who said, no plan survives the first shot fired in anger. I don't know if it was him. It's kind of a well-worn military expression.
Right.
As a battalion commander, battalion's about 750 soldiers. I was an infantry battalion commander. As a lieutenant colonel, was an infantry battalion commander. I would mix things up on my company commanders all the time in training. Even if it was something as simple as going out on a 25-mile force march, we'd provide an order which would have the order of march, and then at the last minute I would change it. And you find some interesting things. I mean, because the commander who was last in the order of march one time, he didn't even bring a map. So he just figured he was going to follow the company in front of him, right?
Oh my.
So he was quite embarrassed. But we would have different training scenarios where whether it was a live fire exercise or like I said, even something as simple as a force march, where we would change up the conditions at the last minute and kind of make people respond to that. That's a simplistic way of kind of doing things. But I think, in a larger picture, in a larger sense, I mean, you mentioned it, when I was not an aviator, you were, but you'd still have, your primary plan, and then you'd have, plan B, plan C, and plan D. Well, maybe you had to throw away plan A quickly because the conditions didn't match the basis of your plan. But the fact that you went through that process and you knew what plan A was, and everybody knew what plan A was, made it easy to deviate to plan B, or
Right.
plan C, or plan, whatever changes you were going to make.
Yep.
So I think the success in something like that, again, goes back to the inclusivity of that plan, excuse me, the inclusivity of that planning process, and the intellectual capital, the intellectual investment that the participants put into it. Because if everybody is engaged in making the plan, when the commander calls a shot to deviate, it becomes easy.
Right.
So again, I'm back to the foundational piece is, an organization which is built on trust, and where the boss engenders an atmosphere of open and honest communication without recrimination. And oh, by the way, like Mark Twain says, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that proportion, right?
Yes, sir.
The boss needs to listen, and the more the boss listens, typically, the better the end product becomes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You think about in business. I've been in business now since I left the Navy in 1995, and I've been in business now since then, 25 years. And I never once had a business leader, and maybe this changes things, but I never once had a business leader say, what if everything went, take our risk models aside. What if everything went to hell tomorrow? What would we do? And organizationally, I never saw that happen. And maybe that changes things now to figure out, hey, look, what is the plan B, C, D, if everything were to melt down, what do we, where do we go? What do we do? Type of scenario.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I don't think, it's what is happening now is so far away from the what anybody ever imagined that I just don't think COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on the world was something anybody envisioned in their wildest imagination,
right.
even as much as 3 months ago. So, most business plans that I've been a part of, you put this thing together and you have a best case model, a worst case model, and then a most likely model
Hmm.
for your forecasts. But all of those models are based on I can't recall there ever being a what I'll call the go to hell in a handbasket model where society just implodes and everything comes to a standstill,
Right.
because that's not likely to happen at all, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Well, you did see some good, but you did see some good, good decision making out there. I'll use one leasing company, AirCap, as an example. I think they sort of had a premonition back in March, and they drew down, they drew down 8 billion of their revolver. Like, okay, we got cash now. We know we'll have cash. I was reading about Barry Sternlit at Starwood, which is a big REIT. And he's like, hey, look, we always plan for good times. We plan for bad times. And we keep a lot of dry powder. And we've got 800 million in dry powder and, 3 billion unencumbered. And, we can use the capital markets. So, I think maybe I'm wrong. A lot of companies do think about, kind of these. Yeah, I know the airlines, kept,
yeah, I think perhaps the airlines may do that more than other companies,
right,
because they've experienced things like this. I mean, 9/11 is still fresh in their minds, I'm sure.
right.
And the business, so within the airline segment, they've lived through it in their lifetime. So I
Yep.
think that's relatively fresh, but perhaps more so than other market segments. They were, as I'm not telling you anything you don't know. They were severely impacted after 9/11, and so they've been through it. But I don't know if any other
Yeah. I
market
mean, look,
segment in the A&D.
yeah, I know some companies out there, they had 2 weeks worth of cash. I mean, they couldn't, they couldn't, they won't survive because they just didn't have the cash to survive. And they don't have the credits to go to, the banks or the capital markets, and they'll go away. But then, there's some other companies out there that have done a great, they've done a great job of managing their positions. And it's really going to be interesting to see, um, you know, how this all, how it all plays itself out. So, what, from your your position as a business and military leader, what best advice would you give people through the next 90 days to roll through it?
Well, stay calm if you can. Talk to your customers and talk to your employees, and just again, I mean, over communication with the customers is and tailoring. Um, Again, my experience is in the service sector. So over communication with your customers and being able to tailor your service offerings to what the customers want and continually tailor them is what's going to win the game, I think.
Yeah, no, well, hey, look, yeah, I totally agree with you. And it's like you said from the beginning, over communication never hurt anybody.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming on today.
Craig, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Let's come back and have you back on once all this is done, and we'll see how we did with we'll see how we did. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate you coming on today.
Okay, Craig, take care.
I hope you enjoyed the latest edition of the Aerospace Executive Podcast. You can reach out to me directly, Craig at northstaresg.com, or check us out at www.northstaresg.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, or on YouTube. Just do a search for Aerospace Executive Podcast. Thanks again. I'm Craig Pittman.